Ms. Dalton. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. I've just introduced you as a former foreign policy advisor, someone for who living out of a suitcase was normal.
Yes.
What was it exactly that you did? What was your job?
My job for many years was to advise people in public life who were trying to achieve things internationally. So I worked for over a decade for William Hague, who was British Foreign Secretary at the time, and my job was to help construct policies that were partly about advancing the interests of the United Kingdom, but in a bigger sense about trying to promote human rights, decency, international rule of law, women's rights, things like that I care very passionately about.
So something completely different than thinking about hares, perhaps.
Yes.
Because you describe one day during the COVID pandemic, you find a young hare on your walk outside, and it seems quite amazing now because there's a whole book about it, and you're a bestseller writer now. But initially, you don't pick it up.
No, not at all.
Why not?
I am a city girl. As you've indicated, my line of work did not involve animals. I felt that animals, nature, conservation, climate issues, those were things that were dealt with by other people. My work, it seemed to me, was about humans. It was about war, preventing war, dealing with the consequences of war and terrorism and things like that. And so when I found myself in the countryside in the north of England, sort of like we all were, stranded in a way in our lives, I was still working on international issues and not really thinking about the landscape around me. So when I came across this tiny newborn hare, perhaps 1 or 2 days old at most, that had been chased by a dog and separated from its mother, my first instinct was just to look at it and take a photo, do that thing that we do nowadays. But it wasn't the instinct to pick it up. I knew enough about the countryside and animals to know that you don't go around picking up newborn creatures. And so my first instinct was to look at it from a distance and to leave it and to go on my way, and that's what I did.
And then you do pick it up after, you go back.
Yes, I went back after a number of hours and found that this animal was still in the same very exposed position, lying in the middle of a track that was used by vehicles in an area that has a lot of buzzards. And I had this rather naive idea, which I write about in the book, that perhaps, given the dangers to this creature, perhaps I should take it into my house for a few hours and then return it to the wild under the cover of darkness. This was this idea that I had. I write very openly in the book about that I didn't necessarily do the right thing, but I tried to do what I felt was the right thing under those circumstances.
You give it milk. You describe how you give it milk. I think we have a few, we have a little clip of you feeding the leveret, which is the right word for a young hare in English. And that also had to do with the fact that information was quite scarce on how to handle hares. Does that say something about how little we know of the animal?
Well, I knew nothing about hares. I was amazed that I actually recognised that it was a hare.
And not a rabbit, you mean?
And not a rabbit. And I think a lot of people, myself included, just assume that hares are just big rabbits. They have completely different lives. They live all their lives above ground, in exposed conditions. They don't burrow. They're very vulnerable to farming activity. Very few leverets make it to adulthood anyway, even with or without the intervention of a human. And what happens in the story is that it became quickly very obvious to me that I couldn't return the leveret immediately to the field, that there was a chance its mother had been killed. And so the clip you've just kindly shown was when the leveret was a couple of weeks old and thriving, but I had no idea it would even survive, the first 24 hours in my care. And I write openly in the book about my fear and my doubt about whether I was equipped to look after an animal. And in a way, the fact that it happened during the pandemic meant that I had no choice. I couldn't take it to a wildlife sanctuary. I just tried to do my best by it. And I was amazed, it was hard to find information about hares, and over the period of time, as the story extended and the hare survived and grew, everything I read about hares seemed to be at odds with what I was observing. We talk about hares as pests, as cowardly animals, as fearful animals, and I began to notice, this complete contrast between the behaviour of this beautiful young hare and some of the things we're told to think about hares. And that got my curiosity going.
I was astonished to read that the most helpful thing perhaps you read was a poem from 1774,
Well,
talking about oats.
Yes. Well, I mean, I do laugh at myself in the book. I don't set myself up as any kind of expert. And I think with hindsight, I maybe because of my background in foreign policy, I almost treated this little animal as if it was an emissary from a foreign land about which I knew nothing. So I ordered up loads of books. I read everything I could find about hares. And yes, I did find a lot of writing about hares that was written by huntsmen, and the odd poet. And there's a very famous English poet who kept hares in the 18th century when he was suffering from depression. And he wrote this poem that I used as a guide to what I should feed the hare. But the serious point is that these are animals that have never been domesticated.
Yeah.
We're used to animals that we have removed from the wild in some kind of way and instrumentalized, often with very beautiful relationships and sometimes not. And there is something about a hare that is so wild that they resist or have resisted that process. They've lived alongside us for thousands of years, hiding in plain sight, and that's why we don't know an enormous amount about them, even if we love them and we use their image on Christmas cards and coffee cups and things around the world. They are an enigma. They are wild.
You go out of your way not to domesticate this particular young hare. You never name her. Yet I could not help but wonder when I read how at some point in time you're on a work trip in the Middle East and your mum is back home taking care of the hare. You are in the back of a cab looking at camera footage of your home, checking up on the hare. And I thought in some way the hare did tame you.
Yes, absolutely. This is, the serious point was, we're slightly conditioned to think that animals need us. We're used to taking care of animals. And I felt, and perhaps in the early days of its life, the hare did need me for survival during the period where it had to have milk in order to survive. But after that, it knew exactly what it needed to know to survive. It goes on to raise young. I had the opportunity to see a mother hare raise her babies in the context of a human home. And the point about my extraordinary good fortune in this story is that I didn't cage the hare. I didn't give her a name. I knew she wasn't a pet. She was a wild animal that belonged in the wild. And for reasons I still cannot fathom, she chose to live between my house and the wild. So all night long she would run the fields. I didn't know where she went. And in the morning she would arrive, shake the dew off her coat, lie down in my house and go to sleep. Yeah. And this is something that hares do. They are very attached to a single patch of land for their whole lives. And this is what the hare was doing. And I wrote the book with a hare lying across the doorway to my office, asleep. And there is no more astonishing sight, I can guarantee you, than the sight of a sleeping hare. And it's why I hope the book is something that gives people a sense of the joy that I felt from this encounter with nature.
So how then did it change you, this encounter with nature?
Completely, and I'm sorry I didn't answer your earlier question. Essentially, I changed and the hare didn't.
The hare stayed the same,
but
you changed.
The hare stayed the same, and I changed. I realised I hadn't been looking for any change in my life, but I loved my work. I was proud of what I did, but I became conscious of the fact that I was disconnected from nature, and I think many of us are in many ways. So the hare taught me to slow down. It taught me to look at nature. It revealed so many mysteries to me, and it made me conscious of the fact that I sometimes think we assume that nature is for people who are really into their climbing, their hiking, who live in nature in some kind of way. But it's our one true shared heritage, and whatever form your pleasure and enjoyment of nature takes, it's fine, and you can come to it late in life. It's a consolation that's waiting for all of us. It renews itself constantly, despite our many activities that are harmful to nature. So we can't hang too much on the story of one magical hare, but it did give me the feeling that all is not lost, that it is possible to think of a situation that involves coexistence between humans and the wild rather than endless conflict.
Well, because you are now a best-selling author of what is basically an animal biography, and you're working on your next book, which also concerns animals and humans and the relationship between the two. Yet this year we saw basically the complete collapse of the transatlantic alliance, the transatlantic world that you helped your professional life to build as a foreign policy advisor. And I did wonder, even though you're now concerned with other things, does that hurt?
It does hurt. And actually, even before what you're talking about in terms of the policies I think you're referring to of the Trump administration, there were many things that it was very hurtful for me to see that things that I had worked on in government that were about women's rights, about trying to improve the condition of people affected by conflict, a lot of that went long before these latest changes. But I am not pessimistic. The future of Europe is to be decided by Europeans. I've been around long enough to hear many politicians in different contexts try to borrow the language of strength. And for me, if you have to go around saying that you're strong, there's a problem. And strength starts with moral strength. And moral strength, for me, is what our grandparents and great-grandparents did to build a Europe that is a place of security and prosperity and progress and opportunity. And it's that kind of moral strength and moral example that we have in abundance here in Europe. And therefore, I think we are going to find our way through these troubled times, just as we have done many other occasions. Not to be, I don't want to appear naive about it. It's not an easy time, and it hurts, but there is always hope.
Because they seem two different planets, the world of foreign policy and the world of a small hare, that you're raising on the countryside. Is there anything you learned in your time with the hare that might give some hope for these feverish times we've just been talking about?
I think, on lots of levels. I think this point about coexistence, it is a biography of a hare, essentially. It's a story that's hopefully will transmit joy to readers in the way it did to me. But I saw how with small adjustments it is possible to improve the landscape in a way that is good for wild animals and that is better for humans. And I think there is some sort of wisdom in that for how we approach these larger international issues. It has to involve coexistence. We all know from history, from our own lives, that you can't have a situation where everyone goes around saying, me first, my country first. And so I feel that message of coexistence and hope and the possibility of change. The best thing about humans is we learn. We learn quickly, we can do things differently. So I think we're all learning at the moment, even if we're sort of reeling. And I'm fairly confident that if we choose to do so, whether in relation to the environment or in relation to international affairs, we can find a path towards coexistence.
Yeah, so that's the big lesson, basically.
Taught to me by a silent hare.
Exactly. Now, this particular hare that you started out with, she has left. She turned out to be a lady hare. I don't know the specific English word for that, but she did have babies in your garden, and I understand those babies now have babies.
Yes.
So you are still surrounded with hare. But do you still hold some hope that you will see her someday?
Well, the poignancy of this experience is that I knew it would end at some point. Life is very hard for animals in the wild, and I was amazed to have so many years alongside this hare. And not only did she raise leverets in the garden, she raised them in my own home. I wrote a couple of the chapters with a pair of leverets tucked away that she'd hidden, one in the bookcase, one under the radiator. She gave birth behind a curtain in my office where I wrote the book, where I spend most of my working life. And and those descendants are still around, and they've had leverets of their own in the garden. So I have to fear that she may have run her final race. I haven't completely given up hope, but to love one hare, you have to love all hares. And I do, and I get such pleasure from observing them. I feel I've been given a gift from nature. I've done nothing to deserve it. The least I can do is to share it with other people. And I've been amazed by how many people love hares. And I would love more people to have the opportunity to see hares. And I'd like us to do more to conserve them for that reason, and in their own right.
Yeah, I see. Thank you so much, Ms. Dalton, for coming to Buitenhof.
Bedankt voor het kijken. Vond je dit nou een goed gesprek? Vergeet dan niet te abonneren of te liken. Reageren in de comments kan natuurlijk ook. Wil je meer zien over dit onderwerp? Klik dan hiernaast.